Thank you, and thank you all for being connected to the fourth webinar of Unit 4. And this webinar, we are going to go through the theory of change, which is the main content of the Unit 4. And we will start with the presentation of George Gray, who will talk about the first two steps of the construction of the theory of change. Then Almudena will talk about the process of mapping the combo strategy with the SDGs. And finally, Diego will present a very interesting case of study of a combo developed on environmental issues. It's a case study that is a very practical exercise to understand how we can create an environmental strategy of combos. So now we will start with George, and thank you very much for your assistance.
Hello, everyone. This is George Gray Molina. It's a pleasure to work with you on Unit 4 of this webinar on the Combos Toolkit. What we'll be looking at today is step number 2, what we call the development of a theory of change. And we'll be looking through 3 steps. I'll be doing this with my colleague Almudena Fernandez. The first step has to do with quantitative analysis and social dialogue. And the third step has to do with mapping the SDG goals against your own national and subnational goals. So let's get started. As a refresher, as you know, the Combos approach is based on the use of as many tools as we can use in the UN system, and specifically within UNDP. As you know, the umbrella for these steps is the MAPS approach. MAPS means mainstreaming, acceleration, and policy support for the 2030 agenda. The Combos approach is part of the acceleration agenda. So we'd like you to think of this as that subset of the SDG agenda in which we want to really lock down, focus on some of the hardest issues: youth unemployment, violence, vulnerabilities, issues that don't get solved with more of the same or with development tools as usual. So we invite you to take a look at some of the tools that we've got at UNDP and at the UN system to get this going. The same steps can be reframed in terms of this webinar. The past week we looked at Unit 3, Step 0 and Step 1, defining the problem. And today we're going to focus just on the development of the theory of change. And for the following weeks, we'll be looking at a roadmap and implementation issues that deal with both monitoring and evaluation, and also having an impact over public policy. As a refresher, as we started this webinar, we talked about what the Combos approach looks like. Just basically, it's defining issues as multidimensional issues and thinking of the solutions as multidimensional solutions as well. So we're trying to get away from a silver bullet approach, from the idea that there's a single way to attack a development problem, and trying to redefine our problems, our issues, in clusters of issues, in combos that make sense in terms of your national development plan, but also make sense in terms of the social science and the environmental science behind that. The first step that we looked at in the previous unit was to define the problem. Problem definition is very important because this is where we usually find most of the issues, the first obstacles. If we define an issue as a sectoral issue, as an education issue only, or as a health issue only, or as a police issue, then we're probably going to miss some of the most interesting dynamics that have to do with gender, that have to do with human behavior, that have to do with markets, and also that have to do with labor markets, social protection, and so on. So we try to keep the problem definition as broad as possible in terms of trying to hit the mark on the multidimensional aspects of problems, and then zooming in on what those dimensions are with available evidence and data. Okay, so today we're going to look at step 2, the development of a theory of change. And before I share some of the next few slides, I just wanted to remind that for many years, we at the United Nations, we worked within what used to be called a logical framework approach. And this is the logical framework approach you're all familiar with. It's a very linear approach to development planning. We can think of steps A that lead to step B to lead to step C with intermediate results and with impact. And we do know from past experience that this is very useful if we think about something like physical infrastructure or building a bridge, in which we could lay these things out very easily. But when we start to get into issues that have to do with social behavior or with environmental feedback loops, we'll find that the logistical framework just doesn't hit the mark because it tends to lull us into a sense of control over variables that we probably don't have control over. So think about issues like youth unemployment, or issues like multidimensional poverty, or issues like resilience to natural disasters. Each of these are multidimensional issues that need to be tackled with a multidimensional logistical framework, if you will. And that's what we call this. This is sort of the successor in the development literature is looking at theories of change, in which we can think about multiple factors affecting something that's multi-causal, and some problems that are complex and difficult to handle on their own. So that's sort of the introduction to this part. Let's go to some of the examples. So here you go. This infographic gives you a sense, sort of a one-dimensional sense of where we're going with this. As with the logistical framework, we're looking at impact, and impact has its own impact indicators. That's at the very top of the screen. We can think of the targets of the SDG agenda and the indicators associated with those targets, the 231 global ones for the 169 global targets. Each of those are impact indicators that have been built, constructed, so that we can reflect end-of-use impact, things that affect human beings, human well-being, or ecosystems, or end results. As we think about impact, we have to go back in the logistical chain and think about a strategy that uses outputs to create outcomes that have an impact. So as we do this in a linear fashion, thinking about the logistical framework, what we need to think about in the theory of change, we'll be multiplying some of the variables by 2 or 3 dimensions here, because we'll be looking at not a single logistical framework, but 3 or 4 logistical frameworks. If we think about citizen security, we'll be looking at a logistical framework for, say, youth employment, but we'll be looking at a different logistical framework for access to justice, and probably a different logistical framework for urbanization and creating safe spaces in our parishes, in our towns and cities. Each of these are combined together in the theory of change. And what we're trying to get at is those factors that we can influence with public policy, which are distinct and different from those control factors that we probably don't have a handle over, such as the age of a person or even where they live. So these are control factors which we probably can't change with policy, but we can change other incentives that have to do with education, labor markets, and risk. All right, so as we start our work in each of our countries, what we would like to invite you to do is to use all existing census data, household survey data, demographic survey data, everything that's available, because at the very starting point, what we want to do is map out the best we can what the problem is using existing data. In some cases, we can literally map out regions, municipalities, neighborhoods, parishes. In other cases, we can't really do that other than with the census data. And we'll use multidimensional poverty indices. We'll use correlations between indicators. We need to take a look at some of the toolkits that we've developed and UNDP in our sister organizations to toolkits that can analyze poverty, that look at child poverty, that look at managerial issues such as the CIGOB. We have a fiscal toolkit that looks at fiscal issues and so on. So each of these might be part of your analysis. But for now, I guess the headline here is just use existing data to zoom in on what that multidimensional problem is. Let's go back to an example. This is the example of municipalities in El Salvador when they were building their Citizen Security Agenda 2030 work. And what they found is that they didn't have enough good data on social violence, so they used existing municipal police registries that had many flaws, that had all sorts of loopholes and gaps, but they used the existing data to be able to describe some of the populations that were affected. We can look at different types of violence using police registries. We can look at things like robbery. We can look at homicide. We can look at domestic violence data. We know that each of these has a caveat. We know that municipal registries and police registries have all sorts of trouble, but this is what the existing data show us. They can show us within some order of magnitude what the red flags are on our map and what are orange and what might be sort of the green parts, or the parts that don't really have high levels of violence. So it's just getting orders of magnitude at this level. This is an example that comes from looking at multidimensional poverty indices. And the nice thing about multidimensional poverty indexes is that we can disaggregate them. So something that has a 51% incidence at the national level of poverty, if we zoom in at the rural areas, we might find that there's 83.9% incidence. And if we zoom in further, we can see that the youth population that does not work and that does not go to school has an 83% incidence inside that 83.9 of rural poverty. So there you have it. In two steps, we've zoomed in sort of the youth correlates of and gender correlates of young rural women who do not study or work and who are perhaps most vulnerable to multidimensional poverty in rural areas in this particular country. In our work on income-based poverty, what we've done in past work is trying to take a systematic look at determinants of poverty exit, and determinants of sliding back into poverty. What we found in Chile is that these factors are different. We've looked at factors that allow people to exit poverty, mostly correlated to labor markets and to education. And however, we found that when we look at sliding back into poverty, the key indicators are not so much education and labor market, but their access to assets like owning your own home or owning your own piece of land in a rural area, having access to some sort of social protection, and having access to some sort of system of care at the local level. So there's different factors that will influence people exiting or sliding back into poverty. So we just invite you to take a look, use the best data that you have at the local level to zoom in to the indicators that you need. This is sort of the first step, just to map these things out. Because what the second step in the theory of change that we do at the UNDP is that we put this all together, we put it into a nice PowerPoint, and then we present it to local populations. So we go down to the local level, to the parish level, to the municipality level, to the neighborhood level, and we share this information in our best analysis of what the problem might be with people on the ground. And through social dialogue, we get to listen to how people see what their own problems are. So imagine if we're talking about something like child malnutrition or teenage pregnancy or social violence, we're probably going to get very different answers from different municipalities, from different parishes on the very same issue. And we welcome this analysis because we know that people themselves have a better grasp of what is affecting locally. So back to the malnutrition example in Honduras, when we did this at the local level in Honduras, some municipalities were very, very clear that the single most important issue in their municipality was the lack of access of water, running water, and basic sanitation. Whereas in other more developed parishes and municipalities, the issue was had more to do with social services, with the access to the right type of health services. And the health service center might be 10 or 15 or 20 kilometers away, so that was too far away. And we had other sorts of aspects that linked to malnutrition, including how to build a diet based on locally available vegetables and protein sources. So in each municipality, we have different types of issues: health issues, nutrition issues, or even basic water issues. What we've been using in different countries is facilitators that get into that do social dialogue, but also we invite you to work with sociologists, to work with anthropologists who are already working in the region through NGOs or through the UN system, and start to understand what is it that people understand to be the problem, and how there's a local vocabulary of how to express what poverty, vulnerability, exclusion are like at the very local level. A second step here in the social dialogue level is to think about stakeholder analysis. And this is something that maps out poverty by influence and by importance. So there are some stakeholders, for example, the authorities that are in charge of education and health services or housing services will be of highest importance if what we're interested in is eradicating multidimensional poverty, because they will have in their hands the key to success in every parish, in every municipality, in every state. So those will be very important, influential actors. Some other actors will be less influential. So if you can map out what actors are like in each at the local level or even at the national level, you have a better sense of where to focus our energies in terms of the effects of that social dialogue. If the obstacles have to do with, again, using a Honduras example, with sanitation and access to running water, then we have a good idea of where the authorities are, if they're municipal based or whether they're national based, or depending on what the water system was like, if there is a local system or municipal system. Okay, so I'm gonna turn it over to my colleague Almudena Fernandez for the following step, which is to map out your national and local indicators into the vocabulary and the language of the SDG indicators. Over to you, Almudena.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much, George, for your presentation, and hello to everyone. My name is Almudena Fernandez, and I'm a policy specialist at UNDP focused on social protection, based in New York, working at the Sustainable Development Group, and working also to help develop some of these tools to help us accelerate progress towards the SDGs. So following George's presentation of building the theory of change in this combo approach, what I want to focus on right now is how to map these combos not only to the specific social problem that has been identified at the beginning of the methodology, but to the SDG agenda as a whole. The idea is to understand the extent to which these combos have the potential to accelerate progress across the agenda and not just focus on one specific goal. And I think it's important to mention that this is something that can be done once the combo and its drivers have been identified and its enablers have been identified. But I think it also needs to be thought of as a reiterative process where mapping the combo and its drivers as it is to the SDG goals can also inform the process of building the combo, because it also, as you will see once I go into the methodology, can shed a lot of light on the impact and on the potential trade-offs, this combo and drivers and the way they're tackled, the interventions used to tackle them, the impact they can have on the different set of goals, and also across the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. So this methodology was developed in the context of a new tool we're working on called the ACT, the Acceleration Catalyst tool, which is meant to be part of the suite of tools that go under the acceleration component of the MAPS framework. But it fits very well with the combo methodology, and that's why we are bringing it in here. And just to mention that the ACT tool is in the process of being developed, and hopefully it will be linked to the combos methodology. So this methodology is also has been used, has been tested in the various MAPS missions the UNDP and other UN agencies have been engaging on in the context of the MAPS framework and using MAPS as a way to support countries to implement the SDG agenda. UNDP took the lead in offering a set of MAPS missions or missions sectoral missions to countries to help them think about how to implement the agenda as a whole. And so far, UNDP has led over 15 missions or 16 missions, more and more so in collaboration with other agencies to various countries. So in the context of those missions, we've been testing this methodology about how to think about acceleration and how to map these to the SDG goals. So the idea is to use as much information and evidence as it exists, as well as the social dialogue, both procedures that George has already discussed as key components into building the theory of change, to also think about how this combo and its drivers will impact the different SDG goals. And this will require looking at perhaps another set of evidence that links the combo not to the specific problem already identified. For example, if we're talking about poverty reduction, we want to think about how the drivers of poverty reduction, be it labor market, education, social protection, also have an impact in some of the economic targets or some of the environmental targets, if at all. So the idea is to go target by target and gather both informed opinion from the relevant stakeholders and from the experts at the local level, and the evidence that exists in the country, or perhaps evidence in countries that have a similar context can be used as well, to make an informed decision whether the application of this combo, the application of the interventions that will enable this combo, will have either a positive, neutral, or negative impact in each one of the 169 targets. Now, it's a bit mechanical and it's a bit burdensome as a process, but we find that it's very useful to really get a sense whether the combo has an impact across multiple targets, and whether there is any trade-offs, if there's any area where the impact can potentially be negative, and the extent to which it balances some of these, the three dimensions of sustainable development. So using the evidence that exists and the social dialogues, and talking with experts, all the information that is available to you, and of course the knowledge of the local context, we map each one of the goals and the extent to which the impact is positive or negative. Once that exercise is done, then we look to summarize this in a way that makes sense, and in a way that can really start a conversation about looking at the application of these combos in the context of the impact on the agenda as a whole. So we can summarize it in terms of the number of targets that are positively neutrally impacted, or negatively impacted, and see a balance of those in just looking at that as a guideline. So for example, some combos and drivers will be very positive across the board. So that gives you a sense. It can also help with a prioritization of the interventions that you're looking to implement. So, this kind of rank can potentially serve as a ranking in terms of what can be applied quickly. And also, how can these be how are these balanced across the 3 dimensions of sustainable development? So we've already coded each of the targets in terms of whether they are most directly linked to social aspects, economic aspects, or environmental aspects. And so with that coding and the extent to which each of these combos has a positive, neutral, or negative impact, you can see whether the impact is mostly on the economic side, on the social side, or the environmental side, and whether there's trade-offs to these. So what we find is when you try and map some of these drivers, for example, like we see here, labor market, education, social protection, what we'll see mostly is positive impacts, and then a lot of neutral. So there's a lot of targets which are just doesn't seem relevant to some of these drivers. But it can also have negative impacts. For example, if you're thinking about a driver in education, so improving education, and in the context of that specific country, one big means of doing this has to do with the building of infrastructure to support education, schools or roads to improve access to schools. Then you can think about that infrastructure potentially having a negative impact, environmental impact, depending of course on the area and where these new structures are to be built. So that will show up here, and I think what is useful here is also it allows for starting a dialogue in the context of the national policymakers about, well, if there are trade-offs, as we see through this analysis, then potentially how can we think about implementing these interventions in a way that mitigates those trade-offs? So can we think about, in this particular example, looking at green infrastructure that will mitigate some of the effects on the environment, or including some environmental education into the educational curriculum that can also mitigate some of these trade-offs. So it opens up the conversation to really think about these interventions across all 3 dimensions and across a number of different targets. So this is like I said, that the analysis of synergies and trade-offs is something that is valuable from this mapping, and that I think it really can help both feedback into the process of building the combo and thinking about how the combo can ideally have as much positive impact and multiplying effects across the agenda as possible. Of course, there's no expectation that every combo is going to have positive social, economic, and environmental impact, because that's very ambitious, and it's just not possible from some of the topics that will be dealt with in the combos. But the idea is to have as much positive impact as possible, and this mapping can help you think about that. And this is just an example of looking at a teenage pregnancy combo, and some of the drivers mapped around in gray bubbles, and how these drivers link to specific. In here, what we are showing is how some of the specific targets that are positively affected by that driver. But I mean, this is just an example, because I think what you see from the analysis is that the impact is much broader. Once you go target by target, the potential positive impact is much broader than just 1 or 2 targets that are directly linked to that intervention. For example, if you're thinking about labor markets, of course, targets within SDG 8 will be positively impacted, but there's so much more positive impact once you get thinking about each target in general. So this is just an example, but I think if we were to draw it comprehensively, then this would be a whole, it would be many more bubbles linked to each one of these drivers. And you can also think about mapping the ones that are negatively impacted. So that's a little bit about the mapping of the combos and its drivers to the SDG agenda. Like I said, the idea is, I think this is a useful tool, one, to really show that the combos work in an interlinked and interconnected manner and go beyond just dealing with one specific problem, but they deal with that problem in a way that has an impact across the agenda. And it also serves as a kind of a reality check about, well, we are proposing these combos, what is the real impact across the 3 dimensions, and how can we really be innovative and think outside the box to make these combos as in a way that they have as much positive impact across the agenda as possible. So we really, that's what we call, so they can really be an accelerators to achieve the agenda. So I'll leave it at that. I'll be happy to answer questions towards the end of the session, and I send it back to Maria Jose.
Thank you, Almudena. Thank you, George, for your presentations. Now I will talk very briefly about the homework of Unit 4, and then we will continue with Diego's presentation. So I'm waiting that the presentation is open. Now I'm moving to slide 20, and here you can see what it's about, the homework of Unit 4. What we want to do is to continue with the combo that you developed on the last unit, on Unit 3. So now you have to continue developing some aspect of the theory of change. So what we want you to do is to think about which is the final impact of the combo strategy that you create, to think about one specific outcome, one product, and to think about 2 intervention or programs. All the information to make up these elements is on the document of Unit 4, and it's important that you have to be very briefly and not to complicate too much about this. It's just an exercise. We know that because this is an hypothetical exercise, there are a lot of assumptions that you have to take. So just think about any kind of intervention that you think that based on the elements that you have identified of the theory of change are useful for your combo. And also we ask you to think about 2 types of quantitative analysis, identifying the data source to use, to give an example of inclusive dialogue for the implementation of the combo strategy. So here also you have to be you have to provide a very simple and brief question. For example, you can think about if you want to do some inclusive dialogue with the local community, you can think about some focus group, but it's not necessary to provide the full strategy, just in 2 lines to think about which kind of dialogue you think that is the best. Also, we need for you to provide a driver of the combo strategy and identify 2 SDG targets that are associated with that driver. And also to state in which dimensions of the Agenda 2030 apply these SDG targets. So if you have any question about the homework, please write us through the forum of Unit 4, and just to be clear, we want a very simple answer. Don't complicate about this. We know that you are working with a very, it's hard to develop the strategy because you're working on an hypothetical case. So just to think about with some assumptions which are the best elements to consider in this exercise. So say that I will pass the microphone to Diego, who will present us some elements of the combo strategy based on environment.
Thank you very much, Maria Jose. Thank you, Almudena, George, for the presentations. So my name is Diego. I'm doing research right now with the Sustainable Development Cluster here in Panama, specifically with the poverty reduction team. And during the last few months, we've been developing a combo about poverty and environment, specifically using an environmental problem as the center of the analysis. But today, what I really want to focus a little bit more into more of the method and not so much about the actual combo itself, because I think that it's more important to actually understand a little bit better how to incorporate environmental indicators and environmental data into the normal and socioeconomic data that we already have sometimes available for and that is usually used for these types of analysis. So the first thing that it's going to be important for us to understand is to try to find the conceptual linkages of the problem that we have already defined, let's say like malnutrition or the example that Almudena gave, that was teenage pregnancy, with the environmental component, if there is any. But it's important to understand that this linkage is going to be affected by the scale of the problem. So it's not the same to analyze a problem at a national level and to analyze it at a local or subnational level. It's going to be affected by the context. Let's say the linkages between environment and poverty are totally different in urban and in rural contexts. There's going to be a direction between the different indicators. Sometimes the environmental issues are going to be a cause, sometimes they're going to be an effect. Sometimes it's going to be a feedback loop, and we need to be fully aware of how these interactions are working and how these linkages are being made. So in general, this is going to be an iterative process, meaning that we are going to be using quantitative, qualitative studies, the mapping with the SDGs as a way to inform the theory of change and the way this data is going to be linkage, but it's going to be constantly updated as we get new data, as we get more information. We're going to be able to refine the analysis that we make. So that's something that we have to take into account. So going a little bit into the construction of the theory of change, a point that I want to emphasize here is that specifically in the environmental field, there's not going to be that much data available for numeric analysis. Unfortunately, environmental data is extremely rare. It's very expensive to obtain, and sometimes it's not going to be available. Even if it's there, it's not going to be compatible with the data that we have. So it's really important for us to analyze not only what type of data do we have, which sources of data can we analyze, but also to analyze the greater lit review and all the previous research experts and all the other information that we can, so we can actually construct a solid theory of change based not only on the numeric data that we might have or we might not have, but in strong and robust relationships that are supported by other types of sources. So obviously, we have to understand that, and that is going to be informing not only the quantitative analysis, because some scientific data sets can be used for numeric analysis, but it also is going to inform the qualitative analysis and the linkages with the SDGs, like Almudena said. Obviously, there's specifically in the quantitative analysis, we have to be very careful about that causal inference that we are making, and we have to make sure that there's some evidence and logical consistency in the conclusions that we make, and that's a place where the literature review is going to be even more important. And finally, we have to understand that even if we can't find all the data, numeric data, I mean, for quantitative analysis, the qualitative analysis can actually inform a lot and can provide some evidence for linkages that we might not be able to find, even in the lead review, about the specific types of effects that some environmental components might be having in some specific families or in some specific individuals. So going even deeper into the qualitative analysis with environmental variables, the first thing that we have to understand here is that the spatial aspects of environmental component of the environmental variables are key to the analysis. So there's no way we can actually analyze environmental components without actually making the map or actually understanding the way in which the geographic distribution of these variables is happening. So this is going to affect the area and the unit of analysis that we choose. Let's say we want to analyze air quality in the city of Mexico. The data that we use there and the information that we're having there, it's going to be totally different if we decide to make another analysis, let's say in the city of Campeche, which is in the other side of the city, of the country. So there's also an equilibrium that we need to find between the data that is actually available and the information that we need for the analysis that we want to make. Sometimes we have only national data, and that's not really useful for making very local analysis. So this type of balance needs to be achieved, and obviously that's going to affect availability of data. The integration between environmental and socioeconomic data sets that are used for many analyses will require some level of compatibility, like at the concept level, at a scale, and in the method that it's being used. So during this analysis that we've been making here, we identified two approaches to the integration of environmental and socioeconomic data sets. In an ideal world, we should be making both of these analyses. They're complementary approaches. They provide answers to more specific questions, different questions for each case. And in theory, both of them allow for analysis across geographies and across time. But there are challenges, obviously, and the main ones are to find the actual data sets that we can use and to achieve the compatibility between the data sets. Because even if we have data, that doesn't mean that we can actually use it for the same analysis. So the first approach that we're taking here, and this is going to be the example that I show a little bit later, it's what we call the upscaling of socioeconomic data. So this is more of a geographic approach to the analysis. The idea is to aggregate socioeconomic household data to higher spatial levels, let's say to the district level, to the municipality level, even to the country level if you actually need to make a national analysis. And this specific type of approach will allow you for a more systemic analysis of causality and spatial distribution, which you can later use for prioritization of specific areas that have more environmental impacts or negative conditions. The other approach, it's what we're calling downscaling of environmental data, which is the opposite approach. It's trying to get environmental data to the individual or to the household level. This involves either mathematical transformations of the data or taking assumptions to the environmental data that you collect at a higher level, let's say at a country level sometimes, or also collecting data at a household level, which is something that it's been increasingly been done here in the region, in some countries, through the multidimensional poverty surveys and all the other information. So sometimes some countries like Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Mexico actually ask as part of their socioeconomic surveys information about vulnerability risks or air quality or like closeness to points of hazard or pollution. So going a little bit into the actual case study that we made, the problem that was defined here was the effect of the urban heat island in the Sao Paulo metropolitan region. So for you to know, the urban heat island effect is defined as the difference of temperature between the urban centers and the rural surrounding areas. So as you can see here, this is more of a general lead review summary of the causes on one side and the consequences on the other one. So we see that the urban heat island has some impacts regarding water consumption, energy consumption. It increases the risks of dengue and Zika in tropical countries because of the incidence of mosquitoes. It can affect also air quality, which both of them affect health. It can increase the rainfall intensity, which can then increase water runoff and then flooding and erosion. So these are like the consequences that are identified in the literature, but when we want to make a specific combo, we have to find that the linkages that we think are important, specifically in this case with poverty. So for example, we know that some of these conditions affect more heavily to the vulnerable and poor populations because of the places where they live or the house itself. We also know that these poor and vulnerable populations have less economic or in general capabilities to adapt to these negative effects. And we'll know that the impacts of these problems might be more significant to them than to middle class or middle income populations. So for example, if you have an increase in water consumption, that amount that is going to be a new expense every month is going to be more significant for a poor family than for a middle income family. And that's going to have a greater impact in the family economy. And finally, we can see that there might be some synergies between the urban heat island and other types of effects. So for example, these poor populations tend to live in areas where you have a lot of risks in terms of environment, so that they tend to live in floating areas or very close to areas where you have huge erosion. Also, because of the type of household, they might be affected, and the temperature inside the house might be even hotter than outside. And because they don't have enough money, they can't purchase an air conditioning system. So there's going to be some type of effects that are going to affect them even higher, even if they're located at the same place where middle income families are. So these are two examples of the ways in which, using a geographic approach, we can first see where the spatial distribution of the urban heat island effect is. So we can see in this map to the left that areas, what we call cluster D, which is the areas where poor populations and vulnerable populations are over 50%, have some districts where the urban heat island is over 7 degrees, which is significant. And if we combine that with the fact that they don't have enough money to overcome the impacts, it might require us to actually prioritize these areas for the interventions, as opposed to other places which might be more of a middle income, higher income areas. To the left, to the right, we have a little bit more of that quantitative analysis. In this case, is structural equation modeling, which is a series of linear correlations, which is a little bit more advanced than the usual correlation analysis that we make. And this, for example, shows us that the population, the middle income, the percentage of middle income and high income population, along with the population density and intersection density, the three of them form a specific cluster that correlates at the same time, meaning that there are effects of the urbanization process, and that actually affects significantly in the urban heat island. For example, intersections, the density of intersections increases significantly the urban heat island effect. Also, the lack of tree cover affects the urban heat island effect. So when we start to think about the theory of change that we want to make to solve this problem, it would make sense to actually address these 2 points and try to see which interventions can we make to take care of the root cause, so we can actually solve the problem. Here we also added air pollution. And we find that actually addressing the intersection density effect and increasing the tree cover actually also benefits and reduces air pollution. So we have that there's some synergies, not only by solving urban heat island and you're solving that specific problem, but also you are addressing some other issues that might have specific effects and might have other consequences to these populations. So a little bit, kind of wrapping it up a little bit, talking about the linkages with the SDGs, like Almudena mentioned, the idea is to find the linkages with the SDGs, not only of the problem, but also on the way in which you can actually devise a specific intervention so you can tackle a little bit or address more than one SDG specifically. So for example, if you want to increase vegetation cover, you might have an option to actually have just direct public investments or have community participation. Both of them probably will address the same problem, but community participation might have additional benefits. Like, for example, there are some cases in Mexico where public space community participation is actually a method for reducing urban violence in the cities. So that's something that we should take into account when we are starting to design the possible interventions that we might have. And obviously, that type of the problem that we devise at the beginning is going to seriously affect the way in which we can make the linkages. So finally, the integration of environmental data and socioeconomic data will require coordination between agencies, a significant amount of coordination. So depending on the approach that you take, it might be easier or harder. So for example, if you are trying to do the integration at a household level, you have information that it's geographically you have spatial coordinate system for some variables, but the census data or the survey data doesn't have this type of system. So you will actually have to coordinate between the people in charge of, let's say, the air pollution data and the survey and the agency in charge of the survey, so they can have an actual match and try to have those data sets integrated. The idea is also to try to identify traditional resources beyond the traditional sources of data. So we've been talking about census data, surveys, we've been talking about administrative registries, but there are also scientific repositories of data, geographic information, even apps which have been created lately for trying to get some data in what is being called citizen science. So those are important new resources that might be available, and we need to find them and try to incorporate them into the analysis. But regardless of the amount of data, it's important to understand that having a lot of quantitative and numeric data is not a prerequisite for doing this analysis. It might be the case where we don't have enough data when we want to analyze a specific relationship, but there's not enough data because our country doesn't really have the data, or we really want to analyze a specific area and we only have data at the national level. But that doesn't mean that we have to stop there and don't engage in this exercise, because we also have qualitative data and we also have the lead review. So taking all of that into account can actually allow you for making this exercise, even if you don't have all the data available at the moment. And finally, remembering that this exercise is just a part of a larger process. And obviously, this is going to be a changing process as if you get new data, if you get new qualitative studies, if you get a new research paper explaining a specific relationship that you didn't find before, it's perfectly fine to update the theory of change. And obviously, that's going to change some of the later implementation and processes. But the whole idea is to try to make this a continuous improvement process and not be discouraged by the lack of information at the very beginning. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to wrap it up there. And thank you very much, Maria Jose, and everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, Diego, for your presentation. And please, now we'll open a space for question and answer. So please, if you have any question or comment about any of the presentation or about the material of the course, you are invited to write on the chat of the webinar. So we will wait a few minutes if there is any question. But in the meantime, I just want to add that what Diego presents is a very interesting case study and a very interesting exercise, because, as Diego said, sometimes we think that the data is a limitation for this kind of analysis, and we know that there is a big issue, that there is a development challenge, but because we don't have the information to raise the problem, we are not able to visualize and to put in the local agenda the problem. So what have been done by Diego is a very important example of how we can find innovative ways to develop a strategy on environmental issues. So thank you, Diego, for sharing with us this case. And I don't know if there are any questions for Almudena, Diego.
So just, Maria Jose?
Yes?
Yeah, just to complement there, I mentioned that this was kind of an example of the first approach, but if the attendees want to check some of the other approach that it's being taken in the region, they can review the multidimensional poverty reports of some of the countries. Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Mexico have actually taken some steps to incorporate environmental indicators to the household level. So using that data can actually, and using a different type of analysis, like a probabilistic regression or something like that, can actually provide some light into some other aspects. But it's important for you to know that there are some steps being taken in the region to address this at both levels.
Thank you, Diego, for your comment. So it seems that there are no questions. I don't know, Almudena, if you want to add something, or Diego, and if there are no questions, we can finish our session.
Just, I guess, as you work on the exercise and the mapping in that context, just to feel free to send questions if at that point, if that helps. And yeah, we're happy to help.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for attending and for listening to us. Thank you to the team and Almudena, George, Maria Jose for organizing this.
Thank you all for being in the webinar, and thank you, George, Almudena, and Diego, and all the virtual team for this session. I think that also there have been some connection problems I can see in the chat, so maybe that's the reason that there are no questions, but we will we record this presentation, and it will be available in the virtual course. So if you have later some questions, please let us know. You can write them on the forum, or you can write us directly. So thank you very much to all of you, and have a great day.